The radio crackled at 4 in the morning, and Daniel Hartman was already awake before it finished its first burst of static. He grabbed the receiver, pressed it to his ear, and heard the voice of Colonel Grant on the other end, sharp and clipped. Report to the Eastern Outpost immediately. New assignment. No questions. Daniel sat up in his cot, his heart pounding faster than it should for a man who had done this job for 3 years. Something in the colonel's voice was different this time. It was not the usual calm authority. It carried an edge, like a man trying to hide fear behind orders. Daniel dressed quickly, laced his boots, and stepped outside into the cold pre-dawn air. The camp was unusually quiet. No engines running, no soldiers joking around the fire pit, no smell of coffee drifting from the mess tent. Just silence, thick and heavy, broken only by the distant hum of a generator. He walked toward the command tent, his boots crunching against gravel, his mind racing through every possible reason for such an early call. Inside the tent, Colonel Grant stood over a table covered with maps, his face lit by a single hanging lamp. He did not look up when Daniel entered. Instead, he tapped a finger on a small village marked near the ridgeline, a cluster of buildings surrounded by hills. "You are being reassigned," the colonel said, "effective immediately. You will monitor troop movement near this village and report anything unusual. Nothing more. Observe only. Do not engage." Daniel frowned. Observation duty was not new to him. He had spent countless nights behind a monitor, watching drone footage, tracking convoys, logging coordinates. But something about the way the colonel said it, the way his eyes refused to meet Daniel's, told him this assignment was different. "Why the sudden change, sir?" Daniel asked. "My unit already has an observer stationed near the northern pass." The colonel finally looked up. His eyes were tired, rimmed with the kind of exhaustion that came from more than just lack of sleep. "That observer requested a transfer," he said. "Effective this morning. You are his replacement. That is all you need to know." There was a pause, the kind that stretches longer than it should, filled with unspoken words. Daniel wanted to press further, but the colonel's tone made it clear the conversation was over. He was handed a folder, sealed, stamped with a code he did not recognize. Inside were coordinates, frequencies, and a single photograph of the village from an aerial angle. Nothing about the file explained why an experienced observer would suddenly request removal from his post. Within the hour, Daniel was in a transport vehicle, riding along a dirt road that wound through hills covered in dry grass. The driver, a young corporal named Owen Blake, kept glancing at him through the rearview mirror. "You heard anything about that outpost, sir?" Owen asked, his voice cautious. Daniel shook his head. Owen hesitated before speaking again. "Guys who came back from rotations near there, they don't talk much. One of them just stopped talking altogether, just sits in the mess tent, staring at nothing." Daniel felt a chill crawl up his spine, though the morning air was already cold enough to explain it away if he wanted to. He asked Owen what he meant, but the young corporal only shrugged, keeping his eyes fixed on the road ahead, as if he regretted saying anything at all. The outpost, when they arrived, was smaller than Daniel expected. A single reinforced bunker sat on a hill overlooking the valley below, camouflage netting draped over its roof, antennas jutting out like thin metal fingers reaching toward the sky. A handful of soldiers moved around the perimeter, their faces unreadable, their movements efficient but tense. Nobody greeted him with the usual banter that came with a new posting. No handshakes, no jokes about the terrible food or the endless waiting. Just nods, quick and distant, before they returned to their tasks. Inside the bunker, Daniel was introduced to Captain Ellis, a broad-shouldered man with a weathered face and eyes that seemed to carry more weight than his rank suggested. Ellis walked him through the monitoring station, a bank of screens displaying live feeds from drones circling high above the valley. "This is your post," Ellis said, tapping the largest screen. "You watch, you log, you report anything that moves outside the pattern. Simple as that." Daniel studied the screen, the grainy black and white image showing rooftops, narrow streets, and the faint outlines of people moving about their morning routines. It looked peaceful, almost mundane. Farmers tending to small plots of land, children running between houses, an old man sitting outside his door, watching the sun rise. Nothing about the scene suggested danger. "Why the concern over this village?" Daniel asked. Ellis did not answer right away. He glanced toward the door, as if making sure no one else was listening, before leaning closer. "There's chatter," he said quietly. Intelligence suggests movement through this area. Could be nothing. Could be something bigger. Your job is to watch and report. Nothing else. Understand? Daniel nodded, though the answer left him with more questions than before. He settled into the chair in front of the monitor, adjusting the headset, syncing the feed from the drone circling silently above the village. Hours passed in quiet observation. He logged the movement of a cart pulled by a donkey, the arrival of a delivery truck, children playing near a well. Nothing unusual, nothing that matched the ominous warnings hinted at by both the colonel and the captain. As the sun climbed higher, Daniel noticed something odd. A group of unfamiliar vehicles began appearing on the outskirts of the village, parked just beyond the tree line, hidden from casual view, but visible from the drone's elevated angle. He zoomed in, adjusting the resolution, trying to make out details. The vehicles bore no clear markings, no insignia he recognized from either side of the ongoing conflict. He reported it immediately, relaying coordinates and a description to Captain Ellis, who studied the feed over his shoulder with a furrowed brow. "Keep watching," Ellis said. "Do not report this outside this station." Not yet. Daniel felt a knot forming in his stomach. The instruction contradicted everything he had been trained to do. Reporting unusual activity was the entire point of his role. Withholding information, especially something that could indicate a serious escalation, went against every protocol he understood. But he was new to this post, and questioning a direct order from a superior felt like a battle he was not yet equipped to fight. As the afternoon wore on, more vehicles appeared, joined by small groups of armed men, moving cautiously through the brush, careful to stay out of open sight lines from the village itself. Daniel tracked their movements meticulously, noting patterns, formations, and pauses that suggested careful planning rather than random activity. Something was being organized, methodically and deliberately, just beyond the peaceful rhythm of daily village life playing out on his screen. He turned to ask Ellis for clarification again, but the captain had left the bunker, called away by another soldier for reasons unexplained. Daniel sat alone with the monitor, the weight of what he was witnessing settling heavily in his chest. The village below continued its ordinary day, unaware of the growing presence hidden just beyond its borders. By evening, Daniel had filled 3 pages of his logbook with detailed notes, timestamps, and coordinates. The unfamiliar vehicles had multiplied, now numbering more than a dozen, spread strategically around the village perimeter. The armed men had grown more numerous as well, moving with practiced discipline that suggested extensive training rather than makeshift organization. When Ellis finally returned, his expression was grim, his usual composed demeanor replaced by something closer to unease. He reviewed Daniel's notes without speaking, his jaw tightening with each page turned. Finally he looked up, meeting Daniel's eyes for the first time since their earlier conversation. "Whatever happens tonight," Ellis said quietly, "you keep watching, you keep recording. No matter what you see, you do not leave this station, and you do not intervene. Your job is to observe." Daniel wanted to ask why intervention would even be a consideration for an observation post, why the captain's voice carried such heaviness when discussing a routine assignment, but something in Ellis's expression silenced the question before it could form. Instead, Daniel simply nodded, turning back to the screen, his hands steady, despite the growing unease twisting through his chest. Outside, the sun began its slow descent behind the hills, painting the sky in shades of orange and deep red, colors that would have been beautiful under any other circumstance. Daniel adjusted the drone's altitude slightly, widening the view to capture the full perimeter of the village and the gathering forces surrounding it. The peaceful rhythm of daily life below continued, uninterrupted. Farmers returning from their fields, mothers calling children inside for dinner, smoke rising gently from cooking fires. None of them knew what Daniel could see from his elevated vantage point. None of them understood that the quiet evening settling over their homes carried within it something far more ominous than the fading daylight. Daniel felt a growing sense of dread pooling in his stomach, an instinct honed through years of similar assignments, telling him that whatever was about to unfold would not be contained within the boundaries of routine observation. He glanced at the clock mounted above the monitoring station. 7 in the evening. The vehicles outside the village had gone completely still, engines silent, the armed men positioned in careful formation along the tree line. Everything about the scene suggested patient anticipation, the kind that preceded something significant. Daniel's fingers hovered over the keyboard, ready to log whatever happened next, though nothing in his training had prepared him for what he was about to witness in the hours ahead. The captain's warning echoed in his mind, replaying over and over. Whatever happens tonight, you keep watching. For the first time since arriving at the outpost, Daniel understood that this assignment was nothing like the routine postings he had grown accustomed to. Something significant was unfolding in that quiet valley below, and he had been placed at the center of it, tasked with witnessing whatever came next, unable to look away, unable to intervene, bound only to watch and record, as the peaceful evening prepared to give way to something far darker. Night fell completely over the valley, and the drone feed switched automatically to thermal imaging, turning the world below into a landscape of glowing shapes against a cold, dark background. Daniel leaned closer to the monitor, watching heat signatures move through the village streets, warm orange figures walking between buildings that now appeared as faint blue outlines. The armed men positioned along the tree line remained motionless, their discipline unsettling in its precision. Not a single one shifted position without apparent purpose. Daniel checked his logbook again, flipping back through the notes he had taken since arriving that morning. Something about the pattern of movement bothered him, though he could not immediately identify what it was. The vehicles had arrived in 3 separate waves, each one taking a slightly different route through the hills, avoiding the main road entirely. That kind of careful routing suggested more than simple caution. It suggested planning, designed to avoid detection from anyone watching the obvious approaches. He reached for the radio to contact Captain Ellis, wanting to share his observation, but paused when he heard voices outside the bunker door. 2 soldiers were speaking in low tones, their words muffled but audible enough for Daniel to catch fragments. He heard the word clearance mentioned twice, followed by something about timing. He could not make out the rest before the voices moved further away. Daniel set the radio down and returned his attention to the screen, though his mind kept circling back to the overheard conversation. Clearance was not a word typically used in observation assignments. It carried different implications, ones tied to authorization for actions far beyond simple monitoring. He tried to dismiss the thought, telling himself he had misheard, that exhaustion and unfamiliar surroundings were feeding unnecessary suspicion. An hour passed with little change in the scene below. The village settled into its nighttime rhythm, lights flickering off one by one as families retired for the evening. Daniel counted the remaining lit windows, noting their positions, cross-referencing them against the layout he had memorized earlier in the day. A small home near the well remained lit longer than most, and through the thermal feed, he could make out the shape of someone moving back and forth, perhaps a parent tending to a restless child. The image struck him harder than he expected. He thought of his own sister, back home, raising 2 young children on her own, since her husband had been deployed overseas. She would be tending to bedtime routines around this same hour, singing softly, checking that doors were locked, unaware of anything beyond the safety of her own household. The parallel unsettled him, blurring the line between the abstract shapes on his screen and the real lives they represented. Captain Ellis entered the bunker again, his expression unreadable in the dim light. He checked the monitor briefly before turning to Daniel. "Anything change?" he asked. Daniel relayed his observations, mentioning the staggered arrival patterns and the overheard conversation about clearance. Ellis's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but he offered no explanation. "Keep logging everything," Ellis said. "Timestamps matter more than ever tonight." Daniel wanted to press for more information, to understand why timestamps carried such weight, but the captain had already turned away, moving toward a secondary radio station set up in the corner of the bunker. Daniel watched him exchange a few quiet words with someone on the other end, his posture rigid, his voice too low to make out clearly. When Ellis returned to the main station, his face had changed. The unease from earlier had hardened into something closer to resolve, though resolve for what, Daniel could not say. "Listen carefully," Ellis said, his voice steady but quiet. "In approximately 2 hours, you may see activity that seems inconsistent with a peaceful village. I need you to understand that your role remains unchanged. Observe, record, do not leave this station under any circumstances." Daniel's chest tightened. "Sir, with respect, what exactly should I expect to see?" he asked. Ellis hesitated, glancing toward the door before answering. "Command believes there are elements hiding within that village, using the civilian population as cover. Tonight, Action will be taken to address that threat. Your job is simply to document what happens for after-action review. The explanation did little to ease Daniel's growing unease. He had spent enough time reviewing intelligence reports to know that claims about hidden threats within civilian populations were not always accurate, and even when they held some truth, the margin for tragic error remained significant. He thought about the family near the well, the child being sung to sleep, the old man who had sat outside his door that morning watching the sunrise with quiet contentment. "Sir, has this intelligence been verified?" Daniel asked, choosing his words carefully. Ellis's eyes flickered with something that might have been doubt, quickly suppressed beneath a mask of professional composure. "That is above both our pay grades," he said. "Our orders are clear. Follow them." The captain left the bunker once more, leaving Daniel alone with the monitor and the weight of what he had just been told. He stared at the screen, watching the peaceful village below, its residents unaware of the conversation that had just taken place about their fate. He thought about reaching out through unofficial channels, perhaps finding a way to warn someone, but every avenue he considered ended in the same realization. He had no way to verify the threat, no authority to countermand orders, and no clear path to intervene without risking severe consequences for himself and potentially making the situation worse. He forced himself to focus on his assigned task, adjusting the drone's camera angle to maintain the widest possible view of the village and its surrounding perimeter. The armed men along the tree line had begun subtle preparations, checking equipment, exchanging quiet signals that suggested readiness rather than the earlier patient stillness. Daniel logged each movement meticulously, his hands trembling slightly despite his effort to remain steady. Corporal Owen Blake entered the bunker sometime later, carrying a tray with coffee and a small ration of food. He set it down beside Daniel without a word, his expression carrying the same weight Daniel had noticed on the soldiers outside earlier that day. "You heard anything?" Owen asked quietly, glancing toward the door before speaking. Daniel considered how much to share, uncertain of Owen's role or his access to sensitive information. "Something is happening tonight near the village," Daniel said carefully. Owen's face paled slightly, though he tried to mask the reaction. "My cousin was stationed near a village like this last year," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "He does not talk about it anymore, just stares off sometimes, like he is watching something the rest of us cannot see." The words settled heavily in the quiet bunker, adding to the mounting sense of dread that had been building in Daniel's chest since the early morning radio call. He thanked Owen for the coffee, though he had no appetite for it, and returned his focus to the screen as the young corporal left, glancing back once, before disappearing through the door. Time passed slowly, each minute stretching longer than the last as Daniel monitored the growing readiness among the armed men surrounding the village. He noticed additional vehicles arriving, larger this time, their shapes suggesting equipment beyond standard infantry gear. He logged their positions, cross-referencing against his earlier notes, building a comprehensive picture of a force far more substantial than what he would have expected for addressing a hidden threat within a small rural community. Around midnight, the radio crackled to life, and Daniel heard Colonel Grant's voice, distant and distorted by static, issuing instructions to Captain Ellis in a nearby command post. The words were difficult to make out fully, but Daniel caught enough fragments to understand that whatever was planned had received final authorization. "Proceed as scheduled," the colonel said, his voice carrying an authority that left no room for hesitation or reconsideration. Daniel felt his stomach drop. He looked at the screen, at the village settled into peaceful nighttime stillness, and thought again about the family near the well, the old man who had watched the sunrise, the children who had played near the road earlier that day. He thought about his training, about the countless briefings emphasizing the importance of verified intelligence before any significant action, and he wondered whether those standards had truly been met tonight, or whether something else was driving the decision unfolding before him. Captain Ellis returned to the bunker one final time before the operation began, his face set with grim determination. "This is it," he said, more to himself than to Daniel. "Whatever you see in the next few hours, remember your orders. Observe, record, that is all." Daniel nodded, though every instinct within him screamed against the passivity demanded by his role. He adjusted the monitor's brightness slightly, ensuring maximum clarity, and settled into his chair with a growing sense that whatever unfolded next would change him permanently, in ways he could not yet fully comprehend. The armed men along the tree line began moving with purpose now, their earlier stillness replaced by coordinated advancement toward the village perimeter. Daniel's hands hovered over the keyboard, ready to document every detail, his mind racing through the implications of what he was about to witness. The peaceful evening he had watched unfold just hours earlier now felt like a distant memory, replaced by a mounting sense of inevitability that settled over the bunker like a heavy fog. He thought briefly about Owen's words, about the cousin who no longer spoke, who stared at things only he could see. Daniel wondered if he was about to understand exactly what that distant, haunted look meant, and whether he too would carry it with him long after this assignment ended. The clock on the wall read 12:15 in the morning. Somewhere below, in a village that had spent its day in ordinary routine, unaware of the forces gathering in the darkness beyond its borders, families slept soundly, trusting in the safety of their homes. Daniel took a steadying breath, forcing his attention fully onto the screen before him, understanding with sudden clarity that the quiet observation post he had been assigned to now stood at the threshold of something far beyond routine surveillance. Whatever happened next, he would be the one recording it, the one bearing witness, bound by orders to watch without intervening, no matter what unfolded in the hours ahead. The first sound came through the drone's audio pickup as a distant crack, sharp and sudden, cutting through the quiet night air. Daniel flinched, his eyes fixed on the screen, as the peaceful thermal outlines of the village began to shift into something entirely different. Warm shapes that had been resting quietly inside homes suddenly moved, some rushing toward windows, others toward doors, their heat signatures flaring with the unmistakable urgency of people startled from sleep. He forced himself to keep recording, his fingers moving mechanically across the keyboard, logging timestamps, even as his mind struggled to process what was unfolding below. The armed men who had been positioned along the tree line advanced steadily into the village, moving through the narrow streets with practiced coordination. Daniel adjusted the camera angle, trying to maintain a clear view without fully understanding what he hoped to see, or perhaps what he desperately hoped he would not. Shouting reached the drone's microphone next, voices overlapping in confusion and fear, carried faintly across the valley. Daniel's chest tightened with each passing second, his breathing shallow, his hands trembling despite his effort to remain steady. He thought about reaching for the radio, about calling out to Captain Ellis, demanding clarification, but the earlier orders echoed in his mind with unyielding clarity. Observe, record. Do not intervene. The scene below grew more chaotic as minutes passed. Figures moved erratically through the streets, some running toward the edges of the village, others gathering near the center where the well stood, perhaps believing that open space offered greater safety than the confines of their homes. Daniel watched the small house he had noted earlier, the one where a parent had been tending to a restless child. The lit window had gone dark now, replaced by frantic movement, visible only through the thermal outline. He wanted to look away. Every instinct told him to close his eyes, to turn off the monitor, to pretend that what he was witnessing existed only within the confines of a screen, rather than unfolding in real time to real people. But his training held him in place, his role as an observer demanding that he continue documenting every detail, regardless of the toll it took on him personally. The sounds grew louder, more distinct, and Daniel found himself unable to fully separate what he heard from what he understood was happening. He kept his eyes on the screen, watching as the organized advance of armed men moved deeper into the village, their formation tightening around the central area where most of the residents had gathered. The confusion below seemed to reach a peak, voices rising in overlapping waves of fear and disbelief. Daniel's logbook remained open beside him, though his handwriting had grown increasingly unsteady, the timestamps scrawled with less precision than the meticulous notes he had kept throughout the earlier hours of observation. He forced himself to breathe slowly, counting each inhale and exhale, trying to maintain enough composure to continue his assigned task, despite the mounting horror of what unfolded before him. Time seemed to distort during those minutes, stretching and compressing in ways that defied logical measurement. Daniel could not have said whether 10 minutes had passed or 30 by the time the sounds began to fade, replaced by an unsettling quiet that felt far heavier than the earlier peaceful stillness of the evening. He stared at the screen, watching the thermal outlines below, noting with a growing sense of dread how few warm shapes remained moving through the village streets. He thought about Owen's cousin, the one who no longer spoke, who stared at things only he could see. Daniel understood now, with a clarity that settled into his bones like cold water. Exactly what kind of memory could silence a person so completely? He understood the particular weight of watching something unfold that could never be undone, that would remain lodged in his mind long after the screen went dark and the assignment ended. Captain Ellis entered the bunker sometime after the sounds had faded completely, his face pale despite the dim lighting. He said nothing at first, simply standing beside Daniel, staring at the monitor, with an expression that mixed professional detachment with something closer to personal anguish, though he seemed determined not to let the latter show fully. "Continue logging," Ellis said finally, his voice quieter than Daniel had heard it before. "Document everything you observe from this point forward. Command will need a complete record for review." Daniel nodded, though the mechanical nature of his response felt disconnected from the storm of emotion churning beneath the surface of his composed exterior. The drone feed showed cleanup activity beginning within the village, armed men moving methodically through the streets, their earlier urgency replaced by a grim, procedural efficiency. Daniel documented their movements as instructed, though every entry in his logbook felt like a betrayal of something fundamental, a participation in an event he had no power to prevent, but now bore permanent witness to. He noticed a figure near the edge of the village, separated from the main group, moving slowly toward the tree line. Through the thermal imaging, the shape appeared smaller than the adult figures he had been tracking throughout the operation, its movements uncertain and halting. Daniel's breath caught in his throat as he watched, unable to look away despite every instinct urging him to do so. The figure paused near a cluster of bushes, seemingly uncertain of which direction offered safety, before continuing its slow, halting progress toward the tree line. Daniel adjusted the camera angle instinctively, though he immediately questioned his own motivation for doing so. There was nothing he could do from his position, no way to intervene or offer protection, yet something within him refused to simply let the figure disappear from view without acknowledgement. He watched until the small shape disappeared into the tree line, swallowed by shadows and distance, its ultimate fate unknown to him. Daniel closed his eyes briefly, the first time he had allowed himself even a moment's respite from the screen since the operation began. When he opened them again, he forced himself to return to his assigned task, documenting the continued activity within the village with as much clinical detachment as he could manage. Captain Ellis remained beside him for a long while, occasionally exchanging quiet words over the radio with unseen commanders, his responses clipped and professional, despite the visible tension in his shoulders. Daniel overheard fragments of the conversation, references to casualty assessments and after-action protocols, terminology that felt jarringly bureaucratic given the raw human tragedy unfolding on the screen before them. As the night wore on toward early morning, the activity within the village gradually diminished. The armed men began withdrawing, moving back toward the vehicles that had remained hidden beyond the tree line throughout the earlier hours of observation. Daniel tracked their departure meticulously, noting timestamps and formations, though his mind remained fixed on the smaller figure he had watched disappear into the shadows, wondering about its fate, wondering about all the fates he had witnessed unfold from his detached, elevated vantage point. The village itself, once alive with the ordinary rhythms of daily existence, now lay largely still beneath the drone's thermal camera, a handful of warm shapes moving slowly among the otherwise quiet streets. Daniel recognized the movements as different from the earlier urgency and chaos, slower, more deliberate, carrying the particular weight of survivors beginning to process the aftermath of what had occurred. He thought about the old man who had sat outside his door that morning, watching the sunrise with quiet contentment, unaware of what the day would ultimately bring. He thought about the family near the well, the parent tending to a restless child just hours before the world around them fractured irreparably. Daniel realized, with a clarity that felt almost unbearable, that he would never know their names, never understand the full scope of who they had been, beyond the abstract thermal outlines he had tracked throughout the night. Captain Ellis finally spoke again, his voice carrying a weariness that seemed to extend far beyond simple physical exhaustion. "Your shift is nearly complete," he said. "Someone will relieve you within the hour." Daniel nodded mechanically, though the idea of leaving his post, of stepping away from the screen that had held him captive throughout the unfolding tragedy, felt strangely disorienting, as though the act of observation had become inseparable from his identity in those hours. He continued logging the diminishing activity within the village until his replacement arrived, a soldier named Marcus Whitfield, whose expression carried none of the visible strain that Daniel now understood marked those who had witnessed the night's events firsthand. Marcus settled into the chair beside him, reviewing the logbook with a professional detachment that Daniel found almost unsettling, though he recognized it as the same protective distance he himself had relied upon throughout his observation duties. Daniel stepped outside the bunker as dawn began breaking over the hills, the sky shifting from deep darkness into pale shades of gray and gold. The air felt colder than it had the previous morning, though he understood the sensation had more to do with the weight settling within him than any actual change in temperature. He stood motionless for a long moment, staring toward the valley, where the village lay hidden beyond the ridgeline, unable to fully process the transition from witness to whatever came next. Corporal Owen Blake approached quietly, offering a fresh cup of coffee that Daniel accepted without truly registering the gesture. Owen studied his face carefully, recognition passing between them without need for words. "You saw it," Owen said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Daniel nodded, unable to form a verbal response, the events of the night still too raw, too immediate, to translate into coherent language. They stood together in silence as the sun climbed higher over the hills, its warmth doing little to dispel the cold weight that had settled permanently into Daniel's chest. He thought about the assignment he had received just 24 hours earlier, the routine observation post he had expected to find, and understood with painful clarity that nothing about the following days, months, or perhaps years ahead would ever feel routine again. The camp around them slowly stirred to life, soldiers moving through their morning routines with the same practiced efficiency Daniel had noticed upon his arrival, though now he understood the underlying tension he had sensed from the beginning, recognizing it as the collective weight carried by those who had witnessed similar nights in villages scattered throughout the surrounding hills. He was no longer an outsider to that particular understanding. He had become part of it, permanently marked by what he had watched unfold from his position of forced, powerless observation. Daniel did not sleep when his shift finally ended. He returned to his assigned quarters, a small canvas tent set apart from the main barracks, and sat on the edge of his cot, staring at the dirt floor for what felt like hours. Every time he closed his eyes, the thermal outlines from the monitor reappeared behind his eyelids, warm shapes moving through narrow streets, the small figure disappearing into the tree line, the sudden stillness that had followed the chaos. He gave up trying to rest, and instead sat with his logbook open on his knees, rereading the entries he had made throughout the night, as though searching for something that might explain what he had witnessed, some detail that would make sense of it all. Nothing did. The timestamps and coordinates remained cold and clinical on the page, utterly incapable of conveying the weight of what they represented. He closed the book and pressed his palms against his eyes, trying to steady his breathing, trying to push back against the tightness building in his chest. A knock at the tent flap interrupted his thoughts. Captain Ellis stood outside, his expression carefully neutral, though Daniel had learned enough in the past day to recognize the strain beneath the surface. "You are needed for a debrief," Ellis said. "Command wants your logs and a verbal summary." Daniel gathered his notebook and followed the captain across the camp toward a smaller tent set apart from the others, its entrance guarded by two soldiers who said nothing as they passed. Inside, Colonel Grant sat behind a folding table, flanked by two officers Daniel did not recognize. The colonel's expression was unreadable, professional and composed, in a way that felt jarring given the events of the previous night. He gestured for Daniel to sit, then extended a hand for the logbook, flipping through the pages with quick, practiced efficiency. "Walk me through your observations," the colonel said, not looking up from the notes. Daniel recounted the events methodically, describing the arrival of the vehicles, the positioning of the armed men, the operation itself, and the aftermath, his voice remaining as steady as he could manage despite the emotional toll each recollection carried. The colonel listened without interruption, occasionally jotting brief notes in the margins of his own separate file. When Daniel finished, the colonel closed the logbook and set it aside. "This information is classified at the highest level," he said. "You will not discuss what you witnessed with anyone outside this room, including personnel within this camp. Is that understood?" Daniel hesitated before answering, the instructions settling uneasily alongside everything else he had absorbed in the past day. "Sir, may I ask what justification was given for the operation?" Daniel said carefully. The colonel's eyes narrowed slightly, though his voice remained even. "That information is above your clearance level," he said. Your responsibility was observation and documentation. That responsibility has been fulfilled. You are dismissed." Daniel stood, though something within him resisted the finality of the colonel's tone. He thought about the small figure disappearing into the tree line, about the family near the well, about the justification he had just been denied. He wanted to press further, to demand clarity about what had actually transpired and why, but the weight of rank and protocol held him in place, the same paralysis that had kept him rooted to his post throughout the previous night's events. He left the tent in a daze, the morning sun now fully risen, casting long shadows across the camp. Soldiers moved about their routines, seemingly unaware or unaffected by whatever had transpired in the valley below during the night. Daniel wondered how many of them knew, how many carried the same weight he now felt settling permanently into his chest, and how many had simply learned, through repeated exposure, to compartmentalize it into something manageable. Over the following days, Daniel found himself increasingly isolated within the camp. Conversations that had once flowed easily now felt strained, filled with unspoken tension whenever the topic drifted anywhere near recent operations. He noticed other soldiers watching him with a particular kind of recognition, the same look Owen had given him that first morning after the operation, an unspoken acknowledgement of shared, unwanted knowledge. He tried reaching out to Captain Ellis for further clarity, hoping that perhaps time and distance from the immediate aftermath might loosen the captain's earlier reluctance to discuss what had happened. Ellis remained guarded during their brief conversations, offering only vague reassurances that the matter had been handled appropriately through proper channels, though his eyes betrayed a doubt that matched the unease still churning within Daniel himself. Sleep remained elusive most nights, replaced by restless tossing and vivid, fragmented images that refused to fully resolve into coherent memory or forgettable dream. Daniel began keeping a private journal separate from his official logbook, recording his own thoughts and questions in an attempt to process what he had witnessed, though he was careful to keep it hidden, uncertain of the consequences should anyone discover its contents. He wrote about the family near the well, imagining names for them, though he had none, constructing a narrative that gave them dignity beyond the abstract thermal outlines he had tracked throughout that terrible night. He wrote about the old man who had watched the sunrise, wondering whether he had survived, and if so, what remained of his life in the aftermath. He wrote about the small figure disappearing into the tree line, unable to stop wondering about its fate, haunted by the uncertainty that offered neither the relief of confirmed survival nor the finality of confirmed loss. Nearly a week after the operation, Daniel was approached by a fellow analyst named Claire Bennett, who worked within a different section of the camp, handling communications intelligence. She found him during a quiet moment near the mess tent, her expression cautious as she glanced around before speaking. "I heard rumors about what happened near the eastern outpost," she said quietly. "Some of the intercepted communications afterward did not match the official reports circulating through command." Daniel's attention sharpened immediately. "What kind of discrepancies?" he asked, keeping his voice equally low. Claire hesitated, clearly weighing how much to share. "The official report claims confirmed hostile presence within the village prior to the operation," she said. "But the communications I intercepted from local sources afterward suggest something different. Confusion, grief, no mention of any hostile elements being present at all." The words confirmed something Daniel had suspected since witnessing the operation unfold, though hearing it validated by an independent source deepened the unease already gnawing at him. He thanked Claire for sharing the information, though the exchange left him with a heavier burden than before, now carrying not just the weight of witnessed tragedy, but growing evidence that the justification provided for that tragedy may have been fundamentally flawed. He considered his options carefully over the following days, weighing the risks of pursuing further clarity against the potential consequences of remaining silent. Reporting his concerns through official channels felt like the appropriate course of action, yet he had already witnessed how quickly information could be classified and buried beyond scrutiny. He thought about approaching Colonel Grant directly, though their previous conversation had made clear the limits of what the colonel was willing to discuss. A letter arrived from his sister during this period, filled with ordinary updates about her children and their small, comfortable life back home. Daniel read it several times, struck by the stark contrast between the innocent concerns described in her words and the weight he now carried from his assignment. He began drafting a response, though he found himself unable to write anything beyond generic reassurances, unwilling to burden her with details he was forbidden to share, and uncertain how to translate the depth of what he had experienced into any form of written communication. The isolation grew more pronounced as weeks passed. Daniel continued performing his duties with mechanical precision, monitoring subsequent assignments with the same meticulous attention he had always brought to his work, though something fundamental within him had shifted. He no longer approached observation with the detached professionalism that had once defined his role. Every village he monitored, every group of civilians tracked through drone footage, carried the shadow of what he had witnessed that first terrible night. Captain Ellis eventually rotated to a different posting, replaced by an officer who knew nothing of the events Daniel had witnessed, further deepening his sense of isolation within the camp. Corporal Owen Blake remained one of the few people with whom Daniel felt any genuine connection, their shared understanding of that night creating a bond that required little verbal acknowledgement. During a rare quiet evening, Owen approached Daniel near the perimeter fence, both men staring out toward the darkening hills in comfortable silence, before Owen finally spoke. "My cousin found someone to talk to eventually," he said. "Took him almost a year, but there is a counselor who specializes in this kind of thing. Might help, if you ever want the contact information." Daniel considered the offer carefully, understanding intuitively that the weight he carried would not simply fade with time, that some form of processing beyond private journal entries and restless nights would eventually become necessary. He thanked Owen, though he did not immediately accept the offer, still uncertain how to reconcile the classified nature of what he had witnessed with any external attempt to process its impact. Nights continued to bring fragmented dreams, images of thermal outlines and sudden stillness, the small figure disappearing into shadows that never fully resolved into clarity. Daniel began to understand, with growing certainty, that simply continuing his assignment while carrying this unresolved weight was not a sustainable path forward. Something would eventually need to change, whether through seeking help, pursuing accountability, or finding some other means of addressing the moral injury that had settled so deeply within him since that first terrible night of forced, powerless observation. 3 months after the operation, Daniel finally reached a decision he had been circling for weeks without fully committing to it. He requested a private meeting with Claire Bennett, choosing a secluded corner of the camp where their conversation would draw little attention. "I want to understand the full scope of what actually happened that night," he told her. "Not rumors, not fragments. Everything you can verify." Claire studied him carefully before agreeing to help, though she warned him of the risks involved in pursuing such information through unofficial channels. Over the following weeks, working carefully and discreetly, she compiled additional intercepted communications, cross-referencing them against official reports and troop movement logs. The picture that emerged confirmed Daniel's worst suspicions. The intelligence used to justify the operation had been based on a single uncorroborated source, later found unreliable, yet the operation had proceeded regardless, driven by pressure from higher command to demonstrate decisive action within the region. Daniel absorbed this information with a mixture of validation and deeper anguish. Confirmation of the flawed justification did not lessen the weight of what he had witnessed, but it clarified the path forward, with a certainty that had previously eluded him. He began compiling his own documentation, carefully preserving copies of his original logbook entries alongside the additional evidence Claire had gathered, understanding that whatever came next would require substantial proof to overcome the institutional resistance he anticipated. He thought carefully about the risks involved in pursuing accountability through official channels. Colonel Grant remained in a position of authority, and Daniel had no illusions about the potential consequences of challenging the official narrative surrounding the operation. Yet the alternative, remaining silent while carrying the weight of what he had witnessed, felt increasingly unbearable. A betrayal not just of the people he had watched suffer that night, but of his own fundamental sense of what his role and responsibility should have meant. He reached out to Owen for the counselor's contact information, finally accepting the offer that had been extended months earlier. Speaking with someone trained to help process this particular kind of trauma provided an outlet Daniel had not realized he desperately needed. Over several sessions, conducted carefully within the bounds of what classification restrictions allowed him to discuss, he began to articulate the full weight of what he had witnessed, the powerlessness, the moral injury, the haunting uncertainty about the fates of those he had watched from his detached, elevated vantage point. The counselor, a calm and patient woman named Grace Whitmore who specialized in working with military personnel exposed to similar experiences, helped Daniel understand that his reaction, the sleeplessness, the isolation, the persistent haunting images, represented a normal response to an abnormal, deeply traumatic experience. She did not attempt to minimize what he had witnessed, nor did she push him toward any particular course of action regarding accountability. Instead, she helped him develop tools to process the immediate psychological impact, while he continued weighing his broader decision about how to address what he had learned. 6 months after the operation, Daniel made his decision. He would pursue formal accountability, submitting his documentation through official military channels designed for reporting potential violations of protocol. He understood the personal risk involved, the potential for retaliation or professional consequences. Yet he could no longer reconcile continuing his service, while the flawed justification for that night's tragedy remained buried beneath layers of classification and institutional protection. He submitted his report carefully, working with a military legal advisor who specialized in cases involving potential violations of engagement protocols. The advisor, a measured and thorough man named Nathan Cole, reviewed Daniel's documentation extensively before agreeing to proceed with a formal complaint. "This will not be simple," Nathan warned him. "Cases like this often face significant institutional resistance. You need to be prepared for a difficult road ahead." Daniel understood the warning intimately, having already witnessed firsthand how quickly information could be suppressed within the military hierarchy. Yet he proceeded regardless, driven by a conviction that had solidified over the preceding months of processing and reflection. The formal complaint triggered an internal investigation, one that unfolded slowly over the following year, marked by periods of intense scrutiny, followed by long stretches of frustrating silence. Colonel Grant was eventually reassigned during the investigation, though whether this represented consequence or simple coincidence remained unclear to Daniel throughout the process. Captain Ellis, contacted as part of the investigation despite his earlier rotation to a different posting, provided testimony that corroborated significant portions of Daniel's account, adding crucial weight to the overall case being built through the formal review process. The investigation ultimately confirmed what Daniel and Claire had uncovered through their independent efforts, that the intelligence justifying the operation had been fundamentally flawed, based on unreliable sourcing that should never have supported an action of that scale. The findings led to policy changes within the broader command structure, new protocols requiring multiple independent verification sources before authorizing similar operations in the future. The personal cost of pursuing this accountability proved significant. Daniel faced considerable professional isolation throughout the investigation process, colleagues uncertain how to navigate their relationship with someone who had challenged the official narrative through formal channels. Some viewed him as a necessary voice of conscience within a flawed system, while others saw him as a troublemaker who had complicated an already difficult and dangerous environment. He eventually chose to leave active service once his enlistment period concluded, understanding that the path forward for him lay beyond the institutional structure that had both trained him for his role and ultimately failed to prevent the tragedy he had witnessed. Returning to civilian life brought its own complicated adjustment, the quiet rhythms of ordinary existence feeling almost foreign after years of service, marked by that singular, defining night of forced observation. Daniel eventually found purpose in advocacy work, connecting with organizations focused on military accountability and support for service members grappling with moral injury from similar experiences. He shared his story carefully, always mindful of ongoing classification restrictions, yet finding that even a limited account resonated deeply with others who had witnessed similar events during their own service, individuals who had carried comparable weight in isolated silence, uncertain how to process or address what they had experienced. He reconnected periodically with Owen, who remained in service but had begun quietly supporting other soldiers grappling with similar experiences, drawing on the lessons his cousin had learned through years of eventual, hard-won healing. Claire Bennett left military intelligence work entirely, transitioning into investigative journalism, where she continued pursuing accountability for similar incidents through different channels, their shared experience from that period forming a lasting professional respect between them. Years later, Daniel found himself reflecting on the full arc of what had unfolded since that early morning radio call, summoning him to an unexpected reassignment. The path from routine observer to reluctant witness to eventual advocate had reshaped fundamentally how he understood duty, responsibility, and the particular weight carried by those forced to watch tragedy unfold without power to prevent it. He had learned, through years of difficult processing, that witnessing itself carried moral weight, that the act of watching and documenting, even without ability to intervene, created a responsibility to eventually speak truth about what had been seen. He often thought about the family near the well, the old man who had watched the sunrise, the small figure that had disappeared into the tree line that terrible night. He never learned their names, never discovered their ultimate fates with certainty, yet he carried them with him permanently, a quiet, private memorial to lives disrupted by decisions made far above his own limited authority. Their memory, though built from fragments and imagination rather than certain knowledge, had ultimately driven him toward the accountability he pursued, transforming powerless witness into eventual, meaningful action. The village itself, Daniel later learned through careful, discreet inquiry, conducted years after his departure from active service, had slowly rebuilt in the aftermath of that devastating night, its surviving residents carrying their own complicated grief and resilience forward into an uncertain future. He never visited in person, understanding that his presence would serve no purpose beyond his own need for closure, yet knowing that the community had continued, in whatever diminished form, provided a measure of peace amid the otherwise unresolved weight of his experience. Daniel eventually wrote a longer account of his experience, carefully reviewed and approved through appropriate channels once enough time had passed and classification restrictions had eased sufficiently to allow broader disclosure. He shared it not for personal vindication, but in hope that others facing similar circumstances, whether as observers forced into powerless witness or as decision-makers wielding authority over operations with profound human consequences, might approach their responsibilities with greater caution, greater insistence on verified truth before authorizing actions that could never be undone. He closed his account with a reflection that had crystallized slowly over years of processing and reckoning. Duty, he had come to understand, extended beyond simple obedience to orders. True duty required moral courage, the willingness to question, to verify, to speak difficult truths, even when institutional pressure pushed toward comfortable silence. He had learned this lesson through the hardest possible circumstances, forced into powerless witness of tragedy that should never have occurred, yet ultimately finding purpose in ensuring that witness translated into accountability, however incomplete, however delayed. The quiet valley where that operation had unfolded years earlier remained, in Daniel's memory, both a place of profound tragedy and an unexpected catalyst for his own transformation from passive observer into active advocate for truth and accountability, within systems too often protected by layers of classification and institutional self-interest. He carried that transformation forward into every subsequent chapter of his life, understanding finally that bearing witness, however painful, however powerless it felt in the immediate moment, ultimately demanded a response, a responsibility, to ensure that what had been seen would not simply disappear into forgotten silence, but would instead serve as a lasting reminder of the profound human cost carried by decisions made in the shadow of incomplete, unverified truth.